History doesn't begin with what we know, but with what we imagine. Long before marble temples gleamed on the Acropolis, before hoplites marched in tight phalanxes across the plains, before philosophers first debated the mysteries of the soul, the Greeks told stories. These stories were not small or simple. They were vast tapestries woven from fear and wonder, stitched together with the threads of lightning and sea foam, shadow and fire. At the heart of this imagination lay the gods, beings who seemed to exist at once within and beyond the world. They were not remote deities dwelling in some unreachable heaven, nor were they flawless ideals of justice and purity. Instead, the gods of Greece were like the Greeks themselves, only greater. They loved and quarreled, they lied and schemed, they lusted, betrayed, forgave, and sometimes destroyed. They were, in essence, humanity reflected in a divine mirror, our strengths magnified, our weaknesses immortalized. But why did the Greeks imagine their gods in this way? To answer that, we must step back to a world far older than the temples of Athens or the plays of Sophocles. We must return to a time when the people of the Aegean lived in small villages scattered along rocky coasts, where mountains divided communities into isolated valleys, and the sea stretched endlessly before them. The Greek imagination was born of geography. Unlike the fertile floodplains of Egypt or Mesopotamia, the land of Greece was fractured and uneven. Mountains cut the horizon like jagged teeth, while narrow strips of arable soil hugged the coastline. To live in Greece was to live in constant negotiation with a harsh landscape, where survival required ingenuity and where isolation bred diversity of thought. The sea, too, shaped the imagination. From the earliest times, the Aegean was both a gift and a threat. It offered fish, trade, and pathways to distant lands, but it also brought storms, shipwrecks, and pirates. In this world of uncertainty, the Greeks turned to myth to explain the forces that surrounded them. If the sea was unpredictable, it was because Poseidon, lord of the deep, was quick-tempered and easily angered. If the earth shook beneath their feet, it was not geology, but the stride of giants or the wrath of gods. This way of seeing the world was not mere superstition. It was a kind of poetry, an attempt to bring order to chaos by giving it a face and a name. To speak of Zeus hurling thunderbolts was, in a sense, to humanize the storm, to transform something terrifying and unknowable into a story that could be told around the fire. In myth, the Greeks found not only explanation, but also comfort. Yet the imagination of the Greeks was not content with mere personifications of natural forces. It was more ambitious, more daring. Their myths sought to explain not just the world around them, but the very origin of the world itself. In the beginning, they said, there was chaos, not chaos in the modern sense of disorder, but a yawning void, a gap between what was and what would be. From this void emerged Gaia, the earth, solid and enduring, and Uranus, the sky, vast and unyielding. From their union came the Titans, and from the Titans came the Olympians, who would one day overthrow their forebears and take their place upon the throne of creation. This cycle of struggle of sons rising against fathers, of new orders overthrowing the old, became a recurring theme in Greek myth. It reflected a world in which nothing was permanent, where power was always contested, and where even the gods themselves were subject to fate. This sense of impermanence was woven deep into the Greek worldview. Unlike the Egyptians, who believed in eternal cycles of stability, the Greeks saw history as a sequence of upheavals and transformations. Their myths mirrored their politics, restless, dynamic, and always on the brink of change. But the Greek imagination was not only concerned with cosmic battles and divine rivalries. It was also deeply human. For in their myths, the gods were not distant overseers. They walked among mortals, disguised as strangers, testing their hospitality, rewarding their kindness, punishing their arrogance. To the Greeks, the divine was never far away. It was present in the rustling of the olive trees, in the crash of waves against the shore, in the flash of lightning across the mountains. The gods were everywhere, and yet they were also bound by the same passions and frailties as the people who worshiped them. This closeness between mortals and gods is one of the most striking features of Greek religion. Unlike in many ancient cultures, where gods were distant and untouchable, the Greeks imagined a pantheon that was intimately entangled with human affairs. Zeus might descend from Olympus to seduce a mortal woman. Hera might unleash her jealousy upon an innocent child, and Athena might whisper counsel into the ear of a hero. To the Greeks, myth was not just about explaining nature. It was about explaining themselves. And so their imagination turned again and again to stories of hubris, of mortals who dared to challenge the gods or forget their place. The tale of Prometheus, who stole fire from the heavens to give to mankind, speaks to this tension. For his defiance, he was bound in chains, his liver devoured each day by an eagle, only to grow back by night. Yet Prometheus also embodies the restless human desire to push beyond limits, to grasp at knowledge even when forbidden. Another story tells of Arachne, a mortal woman who dared to claim her weaving was greater than that of Athena herself. When she proved her skill, the goddess struck her down, transforming her into a spider doomed to weave for eternity. These myths served as warnings, but also as reflections of a society that valued skill, creativity, and ambition, yet feared what might happen if those qualities went too far. It is here, perhaps, that we see the true genius of the Greek imagination. For their myths were not simply tales of gods and monsters. They were meditations on the human condition, on pride, on love, on loss, on the fragile balance between ambition and humility. To hear the story of Icarus flying too close to the sun was not merely to hear of a boy with waxen wings, but to be reminded of the dangers of overreaching. To hear of Orpheus descending into the underworld to rescue his beloved was not just a tale of music and death, but of grief, hope, and the eternal longing of love. Even in their darkest myths, the Greeks found ways to explore what it meant to be human. The tragedy of Oedipus, doomed by prophecy to kill his father and marry his mother, speaks to the limits of human knowledge and the inevitability of fate. The punishment of Sisyphus, condemned to roll a stone up a hill for all eternity, reflects the futility of endless labor and the absurdity of existence. In these myths, we glimpse the beginnings of Greek philosophy, the attempt to wrestle not only with the world, but with the meaning of life itself. And so, from the earliest days, the Greek imagination was never static. It evolved, it questioned, it reinterpreted. The myths that were once told by wandering bards were later written down by poets like Hesiod and Homer, then reshaped by dramatists like Aeschylus and Euripides, and finally examined by philosophers like Plato, who wondered what truths might lie hidden within these stories of gods and men. This fluidity is what gave Greek mythology its enduring power. Unlike rigid religious systems bound by sacred texts, the myths of Greece were living, breathing narratives, constantly retold, reimagined, and reshaped to fit new times and new audiences. Each retelling offered not just entertainment, but a way of thinking, a lens through which to view the world. In the end, the Greek imagination gave birth to more than just stories. It gave birth to a worldview, a way of seeing humanity as bound by fate, yet striving against it, as flawed yet capable of greatness, as mortal yet forever reaching toward the divine. And it is this imagination, forged in the mountains and seas of the Aegean, that continues to speak to us today. For though the temples have crumbled and the statues lie broken, the stories remain. They whisper to us still, reminding us of who we are and of the gods we once believed we might become. To understand the world of the Greeks, we must descend to its beginning, to the dawn of existence itself. Their myths begin not with order, nor with light, but with emptiness. Before there were gods, before there was earth or sky, there was only chaos. This chaos was not chaos in the modern sense, a whirlwind of confusion or disorder. To the Greeks, it was something deeper, something more profound. Chaos was a void, a yawning gap, a dark nothingness that stretched endlessly in all directions. It was from this void that the first forms of existence began to emerge, tentative and fragile, like sparks in the darkness. From chaos came Gaia, the earth, solid and eternal, the mother of all life. From her body rose mountains, plains, and valleys. From her womb would spring gods and mortals alike. Beside her came Tartarus, the deep pit that gaped beneath the earth, a place darker than night, destined to become the prison of defeated gods. And from chaos too came Eros, the force of desire, the spark that drew beings together and set creation in motion. With Gaia, the world began to take shape. Alone, she brought forth Uranus, the sky, who arched over her like a canopy of stars. From their union came the first generation of gods, the Titans. Among them were Oceanus, the endless river that encircled the world, Hyperion, lord of light, Themis, the embodiment of justice, and Cronus, the youngest and most cunning. But as with so many Greek stories, creation was not peaceful. For Uranus, fearful of his children, drove them deep into the body of Gaia, imprisoning them in her womb. The earth groaned under the weight of her captive offspring, and in her anguish, Gaia fashioned a sickle of sharp stone and gave it to Cronus. When Uranus descended once more to lie with her, Cronus struck. With a single swing of the blade, he severed his father and cast him aside. From the drops of Uranus' blood sprang new beings, the Furies, spirits of vengeance, the giants, fierce and wild, and the Melee, nymphs of the ash trees. Thus began the first cycle of violence, the pattern by which each generation of gods would overthrow the one before it. For now, Cronus reigned, and with his sister Rhea, he fathered the next generation, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon. Yet Cronus too was haunted by fear. A prophecy foretold that one of his children would overthrow him, just as he had overthrown his own father. And so, one by one, he swallowed them at birth, hiding them within the darkness of his belly. But when Rhea bore her youngest, she could no longer bear the grief of losing another child. She gave birth in secret on the island of Crete and hid the infant away in a cave. To Cronus, she gave a stone wrapped in swaddling clothes, and in his blindness, he devoured it. The child was Zeus. In the cave of Mount Ida, Zeus was nourished on honey and goat's milk, guarded by nymphs and hidden by the clashing of bronze shields, so that Cronus would not hear his cries. As he grew, Zeus learned of his father's tyranny and the fate of his siblings. In time, he confronted Cronus, forcing him to vomit forth the children he had swallowed. Together, the freed gods rose against their father in a great war known as the Titanomachy. For 10 years, the Olympians battled the Titans, their thunder and fire clashing with the raw might of the older gods. The struggle shook the earth and split the sky. In the end, aided by the Cyclopes who forged Zeus' thunderbolt, Poseidon's trident, and Hades' helmet of invisibility, the younger gods triumphed. The Titans were hurled into Tartarus, bound in chains beneath the earth, guarded by giants with 100 arms. From this victory, the Olympians claimed the world. Zeus took the sky as his domain, Poseidon the sea, and Hades the underworld. The earth itself, broad and rich, remained the common ground of all. A new order had begun, but its foundations were built upon the blood of the past. This cycle of fathers and sons, of violence and betrayal, tells us much about how the Greeks saw power. To them, power was never absolute, never secure. It was always contested, always fragile, always at risk of being seized by the next in line. Unlike in Egypt, where pharaohs traced their lineage back to the gods in an unbroken chain of divine kingship, the Greeks imagined their universe as unstable, precarious, a world where even the mightiest could fall. And so, from the very beginning, Greek mythology is haunted by a sense of impermanence. The story of Uranus and Cronus, and of Cronus and Zeus, is not just a tale of gods. It is a reflection of a culture that knew how fragile order could be. In their own cities, Greek rulers rose and fell. Tyrants seized power only to be overthrown. Alliances were made and broken. Myth and history echoed one another in the endless rhythm of rise and fall. But the myths did more than explain the instability of power. They also gave voice to deeper truths about family, about inheritance, about the uneasy bond between parent and child. To hear of Cronus devouring his children is to feel something universal: the fear of being replaced, the jealousy of the old for the young, the terrible hunger to preserve one's own place in the world at any cost. These are not just the struggles of gods, they are the struggles of humanity. The Greeks did not shy away from these darker truths. Instead, they wove them into the very fabric of their creation stories. Where other cultures imagined beginnings filled with harmony and order, the Greeks imagined beginnings filled with conflict, rivalry, and bloodshed. To them, the universe was not born from peace, but from strife, and it was only through struggle that order could be established. This vision of the world would shape everything that followed. For the Greeks, the gods were not perfect beings dwelling in harmony, but flawed, ambitious figures, each seeking power, each vulnerable to downfall. Their myths taught that behind every order lay disorder, and behind every triumph lay the seeds of defeat. And yet, within this violence, there was also a kind of justice. Cronus fell because he had devoured his children. Uranus fell because he had imprisoned his offspring. Those who grasped too tightly, who sought to control what could not be contained, were inevitably cast down. In this, the myths hinted at a lesson. Power could not be hoarded forever. It was a truth as terrifying as it was liberating. Thus, the world of the Greeks was born. From chaos came Gaia. From Gaia came Uranus. From Uranus came the Titans, and from the Titans came the Olympians. A chain of birth and bloodshed, of creation and destruction, of fathers overthrown by sons. And when the smoke of war cleared, a new order stood upon Olympus, crowned by thunder and fire. The gods of Greece had come into their power, but their rule, as the Greeks well knew, was never guaranteed. For if the past was any guide, even Zeus himself could one day be overthrown. The stage was set. The world had been created. The gods had claimed their thrones. Yet the stories of the Greeks were only just beginning. When the Titanomachy had ended, and the sky itself no longer echoed with the crash of thunder and the clash of steel, the victors stood upon a silent world. Zeus and his siblings had toppled the Titans, bound them in Tartarus, and claimed dominion over creation. But victory brought with it a question as old as the myths themselves. How should the world now be ruled? The Greeks did not imagine a solitary god, distant and absolute, seated upon a throne beyond reach. Their world was shaped by a council, a family of immortals, each distinct, each flawed, each vying for honor. These were the Olympians. At their heart was Zeus, youngest of Cronus' children, but the one who had led them to triumph. His thunderbolt was the symbol of his authority, and from the peak of Mount Olympus, he governed not only the earth and sky, but also the very balance of fate. Beside him stood his brothers, Poseidon, lord of the sea, and Hades, ruler of the underworld. Together, the three had drawn lots to divide the realms. Zeus claimed the heavens, Poseidon the oceans, and Hades the shadowed kingdom of the dead. The earth itself remained in common, a neutral ground where the powers of each might overlap. Yet Zeus did not rule alone. Around him gathered a host of siblings, children, and allies, each embodying a force of nature, a human passion, or a divine principle. This was the Olympian court. Hera, queen of the gods, guardian of marriage, fierce in loyalty and vengeance alike. Demeter, goddess of the grain, gave humanity the bounty of the harvest. Hestia, gentle keeper of the hearth, whose flame burned at the center of every home. Athena, born full-grown from Zeus' head, embodiment of wisdom, strategy, and civic order. Ares, god of war, reveler in bloodshed, the antithesis of his sister's cool reason. Apollo, radiant god of light, music, and prophecy, whose voice spoke through the oracle at Delphi. Artemis, his twin, mistress of the hunt, of moonlight and wilderness. Hephaestus, the crippled smith, whose forge crafted the weapons of gods and heroes. Aphrodite, born of sea foam, goddess of love and desire, whose beauty swayed both gods and men. Hermes, fleet-footed trickster, herald of Zeus, patron of travelers and thieves. Dionysus, late to the council, god of wine, ecstasy, and the dissolution of boundaries. Each of these gods had its own myths, its own shrines, its own circle of worshippers. But together, they formed something greater, a pantheon, a divine society. The image of the gods gathered in council atop Olympus is not merely a story. It reflects the world in which the Greeks themselves lived. Unlike the centralized monarchies of Egypt or Mesopotamia, Greece was a patchwork of city-states, each with its own rulers, laws, and customs. No single power held sway for long. Alliances were forged and broken, rivalries flared, and authority was always negotiated. The Olympians mirrored this order. They were a family, but also a senate, a gathering of competing voices. Decisions were made in council, not by Zeus alone. In Homer's Iliad, the gods debate, argue, and scheme, just as Greek politicians did in the assembly halls of their cities. Their quarrels, their jealousies, their uneasy alliances, all of these reflected the fractured, contentious, and yet resilient nature of Greek society. It is striking how deeply the Greeks humanized their gods. Zeus was powerful, but he could be deceived. Hera was regal, but often consumed by jealousy. Ares was strong, but foolish. Athena was wise, but cold. Aphrodite was beautiful, but capricious. Unlike the distant, unchanging gods of other civilizations, the Olympians were flawed, passionate, and fallible. To worship them was not to imagine perfection, but to hold a mirror up to humanity itself. The Greeks projected onto their gods the very struggles they lived with, the conflicts of family, the temptations of desire, the hunger for power, the inevitability of loss. But the Olympians were not merely figures of myth. They were woven into the daily life of every Greek. Their images stood in temples and shrines, their names invoked in oaths, their festivals marking the rhythms of the year. To speak of the Olympians is to speak not only of mythology, but of religion, ritual, and culture. At Olympia, Zeus was honored with games that drew athletes from across the Greek world. In Athens, Athena's temple, the Parthenon, crowned the Acropolis, its marble columns gleaming in the sun. At Eleusis, initiates walked in solemn procession to honor Demeter, goddess of the harvest, in mysteries so secret that their details have never been revealed. At Delphi, Apollo's oracle spoke cryptic words that guided kings, generals, and statesmen. Each god had their domain, their sphere of influence, but their power was never absolute. The Greeks approached them not as omnipotent beings, but as forces to be bargained with, persuaded, and honored. A sailor might pray to Poseidon for calm seas, but he would also offer a sacrifice to Athena for wisdom or to Hermes for luck. Worship was plural, layered, pragmatic. And at the center of it all stood the idea of reciprocity. The Greeks called it deuteida, I give, so that you may give. Sacrifices, libations, festivals, and prayers were offerings in a great cycle of exchange. If the gods were honored, they would grant their favor. If they were neglected or insulted, they might withdraw it or worse, bring ruin. It is here that we begin to see what mythology meant to the Greeks. It was not simply entertainment, nor even just a way of explaining the world. It was a living framework of meaning, one that bound together city, family, and individual with the powers that shaped their lives. And yet, within this order, there was always tension. For the Olympians were not a serene harmony, but a fragile balance. Their myths are filled with rivalry. Athena against Poseidon for the patronage of Athens, Hera against Zeus for his endless infidelities, Apollo against Hermes in contests of wit, Aphrodite against Artemis in matters of love and chastity. Each story is a reminder that divine order was never still, but always in motion. In this, the Olympian order reflected something essential about the Greek worldview. To them, the cosmos was not a static hierarchy, but a dynamic interplay of forces. Order was achieved not by erasing conflict, but by balancing it, by holding together opposites without ever fully reconciling them. Thus, the gods of Olympus reigned not as perfect rulers, but as a family of flawed immortals, reflecting in their squabbles and passions the very society that worshipped them. When the Greeks looked up to the snow-capped peak of Olympus, they did not see distant, unchanging divinity. They saw themselves magnified, immortalized, and caught in the same endless rhythm of rivalry, love, betrayal, and reconciliation. In their gods, the Greeks found both comfort and warning. Comfort, in the thought that their struggles were shared even by the divine. Warning, in the knowledge that no order was permanent, no power unshakable, no harmony free from discord. This was the Olympian order, a mirror held up to humanity, gleaming with both light and shadow. And it would shape not only the myths of Greece, but the very way its people saw the world, themselves, and their place within the cosmos. The War of the Titans had ended. The thunderous echoes of battle had faded into silence, and from that silence emerged a new world. Zeus and his siblings stood victorious. The old order of Cronus and the Titans had been broken, chained deep in the abyss of Tartarus. Yet in triumph arose a new question. How should creation itself now be governed? The Greeks imagined no solitary god enthroned in unreachable heaven. Their vision was more complex, more human, and perhaps more political. From the high peak of Mount Olympus, wreathed in cloud and snow, they envisioned not a single ruler, but a council, a family, a gathering of gods, each with their own domains, their own passions, their own flaws. This was the Olympian order. After the Titanomachy, the three brothers Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades drew lots to divide the cosmos among themselves. By chance or by destiny, the sky and thunder fell to Zeus. The sea, fathomless and shifting, went to Poseidon. And the underworld, realm of shadow and the dead, was given to Hades. The earth itself, rich with forests and rivers, was left in common. A contested ground where gods and mortals alike would live out their fates. But the world was never ruled by these three alone. Around them gathered a constellation of divine figures, each embodying a power, an idea, a force of nature. Together, they became the pantheon of the Greeks. Hera, queen of the gods, fierce and jealous, guardian of marriage. Demeter, who brought the grain, the harvest, and the rhythms of fertility. Hestia, quiet keeper of the hearth, her flame glowing in every home. Athena, born from Zeus' mind, goddess of wisdom and strategy. Ares, her opposite, embodies the chaos of battle and the lust for blood. Apollo, radiant god of prophecy, music, and light. Artemis, his twin, the untamed mistress of the hunt. Hephaestus, the smith, lame and exiled, yet master of fire and craft. Aphrodite, goddess of desire, was born from the foam of the sea. Hermes, the trickster, swift messenger, patron of thieves and travelers. Dionysus, latecomer to Olympus, god of wine, ecstasy, and madness. Each of these gods had its myths, its temples, and its circle of worshippers. Each was adored in different ways across the scattered city-states of Greece. Yet together, they were imagined as one divine household, seated in council at the summit of Olympus. The vision of the Olympians was not simply a tale of gods. It was, in truth, a mirror of Greek society itself. Unlike the centralized empires of Egypt or Mesopotamia, Greece was a patchwork of independent city-states. Each had its own leaders, its own traditions, its own ambitions. Power was rarely stable, alliances were fragile, rivalries constant. And so too with the gods. Olympus was less a throne room than a council chamber. The gods debated, plotted, and quarreled. Decisions were argued over, alliances shifted, jealousies flared. Zeus might hold the thunderbolt, but his rule was never absolute. In the Iliad, we see them most clearly. As mortals fight on the plain of Troy, the gods themselves argue and take sides. Athena aiding the Greeks, Aphrodite protecting Paris, Hera plotting behind Zeus's back. Their conflicts are human conflicts, written large against the canvas of the cosmos. For the Greeks, the divine was not perfection. It was a struggle. The gods themselves carried human flaws: anger, lust, pride, and vengeance. To worship them was not to aspire to purity, but to acknowledge that the world itself was woven from conflict as much as from harmony. Yet the Olympians were not distant abstractions. They were present in every aspect of Greek life. Their temples crowned hills and valleys. Their festivals marked the passing of seasons. Their names were spoken in oaths, prayers, and sacrifices. At Olympia, the games were held in Zeus' honor. In Athens, the Parthenon rose as a monument to Athena. At Delphi, Apollo spoke through the Pythia, whose cryptic prophecies shaped the choices of kings and generals. At Eleusis, Demeter was worshipped in mysteries so sacred that their secrets have never been revealed. Each god demanded honor, and each gave favor in return. A fisherman might pray to Poseidon for safe waters, a soldier to Ares for courage, a craftsman to Hephaestus for skill, a young lover to Aphrodite for beauty's blessing. This relationship was transactional. The Greeks had a phrase, "Deity, I give, so that you may give." Sacrifices of wine, grain, or animal flesh were not charity, they were bargains. If the gods were honored, they might bless. If neglected or insulted, they might punish. Religion in Greece was never about salvation or sin. It was about balance, reciprocity, and respect for powers that could never be ignored. And yet, beneath all this, there lies something deeper. The Olympian order is not one of serene unity. It is one of tension, of balance through opposition. Athena's wisdom stands against Ares' fury. Apollo's clarity contrasts with Dionysus' ecstasy. Hera's rigid loyalty clashes with Zeus' wandering desire. Each god embodies a force that resists, contradicts, or complements another. This was the Greek understanding of the cosmos, that it was not a fixed order, but a shifting interplay of opposites. Conflict was not the breakdown of order, it was its very substance. Harmony was never final, but always provisional, always contested. The Olympian Council was, in this way, an eternal reflection of the human condition. For the Greeks, the boundary between mortal and divine was never absolute. The gods were not only beings of the sky and sea, but presences who could step into the lives of men and women at any moment. They came as helpers, as rivals, as seducers, as destroyers. And in their stories, they blurred the fragile line that separates human from divine. The Olympians did not remain cloistered in the clouds of Olympus. They descended to the fields, the forests, and the cities of mortals. They touched human lives in ways both wondrous and terrible. And in doing so, They revealed a truth that the Greeks held at the heart of their mythology. The gods were never far away. Above all, it was Zeus who most often crossed this boundary. As king of the gods, he sought not only to govern the skies but to leave his mark upon the earth. His passions were notorious. Time and again, he descended in disguise, driven by desire for mortal women. He came as a swan to Leda, as a golden shower of light to Danae, as a bull to carry Europa across the sea. Each tale spoke of unions between mortals and the divine unions that produced children neither wholly human nor wholly god. These were the heroes: Hercules, Perseus, and Helen of Troy, figures whose extraordinary lives bore the mark of their dual parentage. For the Greeks, such stories explained why certain mortals could rise above ordinary limits, achieving deeds of strength, cunning, or beauty that seemed impossible for human flesh alone. But there is a darker undercurrent to these myths. Zeus' pursuits are often described in terms that we, today, would call coercive, even violent. To the Greeks, this was not a contradiction. The gods embodied not morality, but power. Zeus' liaisons revealed both the irresistible allure of divinity and its terrifying disregard for human boundaries. In every story of his descent, there is both awe and fear. But where Zeus descended, Hera followed. His wife and sister, the queen of Olympus, became infamous for her jealous wrath. Again and again, she punished the women whom Zeus desired, whether mortal or immortal, along with their children. When Zeus loved the mortal Semele, Hera tricked her into demanding to see Zeus in his full divine form. Consumed by thunder and flame, Semele perished. Yet from her ashes, Dionysus was born. When Zeus lay with Alcmene, Hera sent serpents to kill the infant Hercules in his cradle. Only the child's divine strength saved him. And when Zeus fathered Helen, whose beauty would one day spark the Trojan War, Hera's enmity lingered through generations. These tales of Hera's vengeance are more than just gossip of the gods. They echo the lived experience of Greek society, where marriage, loyalty, and the preservation of lineage were central. Hera's jealous fury was not only personal. It was a cosmic enforcement of order, punishing the breaches that Zeus so casually committed. Among all the Olympians, it was Hermes who most often walked openly in the world of men. Swift-footed and cunning, he guided travelers along roads and boundaries, protected merchants, and whispered lies into the ears of thieves. To meet Hermes was to face luck itself, fortune or misfortune, depending on his mood. He was the messenger between realms, carrying words from Olympus to Earth and escorting the souls of the dead down to Hades. In this, Hermes embodied the liminal, the spaces between. Roads, thresholds, markets, all places of movement and exchange, were his domain. Small statues called herms, marked with his image, stood along paths and at city gates, ensuring his protection. In Hermes, the Greeks captured a truth about life itself, that it is never fixed, but always in motion. That destiny itself lies at the crossroads. Other gods came not to seduce or to trick, but to guide. Athena, goddess of wisdom, was among the most present in mortal affairs. She aided Perseus in slaying Medusa, giving him the mirror shield that turned the monster's gaze back upon itself. She stood by Odysseus, whispering strategies and disguises as he made his long journey home from Troy. Athena's interventions were not the chaotic intrusions of passion, but the steady voice of reason. She offered mortals the tools of craft and thought. In this way, she embodied the very skills that made Greek civilization flourish: strategy in war, skill in weaving, clarity in counsel. Athena's closeness to Athens itself was immortalized in the Parthenon, the great temple that crowned the Acropolis. Within its marble walls, the Athenians honored her not just as a goddess, but as the very essence of their identity. But not all divine encounters brought gifts. To meet a god could be dangerous. When the hunter Actaeon stumbled upon Artemis bathing, she transformed him into a stag. His own hounds tore him apart. When Niobe boasted that she was greater than Leto, mother of Apollo and Artemis, the twin gods struck down all her children in vengeance. These stories are not merely cruel fables. They reflect a profound warning. Hubris, the arrogance of mortals who believe they can rival or mock the gods. For the Greeks, hubris was the greatest sin. To forget one's mortal limits, to claim equality with the divine, was to invite destruction. These myths of punishment were lessons, cautioning every listener to live with humility before powers greater than themselves. And yet, despite the dangers, mortals longed for contact with the divine. They prayed, sacrificed, and told stories of gods who disguised themselves as strangers, knocking at the doors of humble farmers. To show hospitality was a sacred duty, for any beggar or wanderer might secretly be Zeus himself, testing human virtue. This constant possibility that the divine might appear at any moment shaped Greek culture with a sense of awe and vigilance. The gods were not far away. They were here, among us, unseen. If the gods embodied forces beyond human control, it was the heroes who carried the burden of these forces into the world of men. The Greek hero was not simply a warrior, nor just a figure of strength. He was a mortal who stood at the edge of human limits, often touched by divinity, yet doomed by his mortality. The Greeks told their stories not only to celebrate victory or power, but to meditate on the fragile balance between greatness and downfall. For in every hero's tale, there runs a common thread, that to rise too high was to invite the gaze of the gods, and to fall was often inevitable. The Greek word for hero, heros, does not mean what it does today. It did not simply mean a virtuous man or a selfless protector. The hero was larger than life, both admired and feared. He was someone whose deeds set him apart, who bore divine ancestry or divine favor, and who left behind a memory so enduring that even death could not erase it. To be a hero was to live dangerously close to the gods, to risk both glory and ruin. The greatest of all heroes was Heracles, known to the Romans as Hercules. Born of Zeus and the mortal Alcmene, he embodied the contradiction of heroism, strength unmatched, but also suffering without equal. From infancy, Hera marked him with hatred. The serpents she sent to kill him in his cradle became his first proof of divine strength. Yet as he grew, his story was not one of triumph alone, but of torment. Driven mad by Hera's influence, Heracles murdered his wife and children. In penance, he was bound to serve King Eurystheus, who devised for him 12 impossible labors: to slay the Nemean lion, to cut off the many heads of the Hydra, to capture the golden hind of Artemis, to clean the stables of Augeas in a single day. Each labor became a tale of endurance, of courage, and of the will to overcome the impossible. Yet behind them lies a darker truth, that Heracles' strength was both his gift and his curse. His life was not a reward for being the son of Zeus, but a punishment for it. His glory was inseparable from his suffering. In the end, Heracles achieved apotheosis, rising to Olympus after death to live among the gods. But to reach that point, he endured pain beyond what any mortal could bear. The Greeks saw in him not just a tale of conquest, but a lesson that greatness demands sacrifice, and that strength without suffering is incomplete. Where Heracles endured through torment, Perseus triumphed through divine favor. Born of Danae, who had been imprisoned in a bronze tower, Perseus was the son of Zeus, born in secret when the god came to her as a shower of golden light. His most famous feat was the slaying of Medusa, the Gorgon whose gaze turned men to stone. Armed with gifts from the gods, Hermes' winged sandals, Hades' helm of invisibility, and Athena's shield, Perseus succeeded where no other mortal dared. This story reflects another truth about the hero, that his victories were never his alone. Behind Perseus stood the will of the gods. The hero was the instrument of divine power, a vessel through which Olympus enacted its designs. And yet, his human choices, his courage to face the Gorgon, and his cunning to use the shield as a mirror gave the story its enduring meaning. For while the gods armed him, it was Perseus himself who dared to face the monster. Among the heroes of the Trojan War, none shone brighter than Achilles. His very existence was shaped by fate. Born of a mortal king and the sea goddess Thetis, he was dipped in the river Styx, his body made invulnerable except for the heel by which his mother held him. Achilles' story is one of rage. In Homer's Iliad, he withdraws from battle in fury at being dishonored, only to return when his beloved companion Patroclus is slain. His vengeance is terrible. He slays Hector, the champion of Troy, and desecrates his body. Yet in this rage, we see the tragedy of the hero. His greatness isolates him. His wrath consumes him, and his destiny is already written. He may live a long, obscure life, or a short, glorious one remembered forever. Achilles chooses glory, knowing it will cost him his life. The Greeks saw in Achilles not only the brilliance of a warrior, but the unbearable weight of mortality. To be great was to burn bright and to burn out quickly. Not all heroes were warriors of strength or speed. Odysseus, king of Ithaca, embodied another form of heroism: cunning, endurance, and resilience. His journey home from Troy lasted 10 years, filled with trials that tested his wit and his will. He blinded the Cyclops Polyphemus, resisted the siren's song, and descended into the underworld. Each encounter revealed his gift for strategy, but also his flaw, his pride. When he taunted Polyphemus, revealing his name, he brought Poseidon's wrath upon himself. His hubris prolonged his suffering, keeping him from home for years. Yet in Odysseus, the Greeks saw a hero who embodied their own values: intelligence, adaptability, and endurance. His victory was not in strength alone, but in patience, resilience, and the will to endure when all seemed lost. Threaded through every hero's tale is the shadow of hubris, the overstepping of mortal limits. The myths are filled with cautionary figures. Bellerophon, who tried to ride Pegasus to Olympus, was thrown down to earth. Niobe, who boasted she was greater than the goddess Leto, saw her children struck down by Apollo and Artemis. These stories were not mere warnings to children. They were profound reflections on the human condition. The Greeks believed that human life was defined by boundaries between mortal and divine, between fortune and disaster. To forget these boundaries was to invite ruin. Hubris was not simply arrogance. It was the denial of fate. And fate, to the Greeks, was inexorable. Above even the gods stood the Moirai, the Fates. These three shadowy figures spun, measured, and cut the thread of every life. Even Zeus himself could not alter their decrees. This belief in fate gave the Greek hero his tragic grandeur. For the hero struggled not against chance, but against inevitability. His greatness lay in how he met his destiny, whether with courage, defiance, or despair. When Oedipus fled from the prophecy that he would kill his father and marry his mother, he only ran toward its fulfillment. His story reminds us that knowledge cannot save us from what has been decreed. The Greeks saw in fate both terror and meaning. If the end was inevitable, then the measure of a life was not how long it lasted, but how boldly it was lived. If the Greek gods embodied the powers of the world, and the heroes carried those powers into mortal life, then the underworld reminded all men of the same truth: that death is the one fate no one can escape. The Greeks did not imagine a paradise of reward or a hell of punishment alone. Their vision of the afterlife was more complex, more layered, and in many ways, more haunting. It was not only a place of judgment, it was a mirror, reflecting the lives that mortals had lived, the choices they had made, and the truths they could not escape. The ruler of this realm was Hades, brother of Zeus and Poseidon. When the cosmos was divided, Zeus took the sky, Poseidon the sea, and Hades the realm below. Hades is often misunderstood. To later imaginations, he became a devil figure, an embodiment of evil. But to the Greeks, he was something else, stern, inexorable, unyielding yet not malevolent. He was not the punisher of souls, but their keeper. He ensured that the dead remained in their place, that the order of the cosmos was preserved. His name itself was often avoided. The Greeks spoke instead of Platon, the wealthy one. For in the earth lay all minerals, all seeds, all the riches hidden from mortal eyes. For the Greeks, death was not an end but a passage. At the moment of death, the soul, the psyche, departed the body as a shadow or breath. It traveled downward, toward the banks of a dark river, the Styx, whose name meant hatred. There, the ferryman Charon waited. For a small coin, placed in the mouth of the dead during burial, he would ferry the soul across. Those without proper rites, without burial or coin, wandered eternally at the river's edge, restless, forgotten, and denied passage. This fear was so great that Greek families placed immense importance on funeral rituals. To die without them was to be condemned not by the gods, but by neglect, cut off from the eternal community of the dead. Once ferried across, the soul passed through the gates of the underworld, guarded by the hound Cerberus, whose 3 heads kept the living out and the dead within. Beyond lay the kingdom of Hades. The underworld was not uniform. It was divided into regions that reflected the diversity of human fate. The asphodel meadows, the vast plain where the majority of souls dwelt. Neither rewarded nor punished, they lingered in a shadowy half-existence, pale reflections of their former selves. Heroes, farmers, kings, all alike in this gray eternity. The Greeks imagined the afterlife not as a glorious reward, but as a leveling, a reminder of the fleeting nature of earthly fame. The fields of punishment. Here, the souls of those who had offended the gods endured eternal torment. Tantalus, who stole ambrosia from Olympus, was doomed to stand in a pool of water that receded whenever he tried to drink, beneath fruit that withdrew when he reached. Sisyphus, who cheated death, forever rolled his boulder uphill, only for it to crash down each time. These stories became symbols of futility, of the endless struggle without release. Elysium, or the Elysian fields, reserved for the righteous and heroic. This was the closest the Greeks came to imagining paradise. Bathed in perpetual light, filled with music and peace, it was the dwelling place of souls who had lived with justice and virtue, or who had been chosen by the gods. The Isles of the Blessed. Later traditions imagined an even higher reward, a place where those who had lived 3 virtuous lives were granted eternal joy. Here, the Greeks hinted at the possibility of rebirth, of the soul's journey stretching across ages. In these realms, we see the Greek worldview, that the afterlife was not equal for all, but shaped by fate, by deeds, and by divine judgment. At the heart of this process stood the judges, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus. Mortal kings in life, they were appointed in death to weigh the deeds of souls. They did not act as gods, nor as tyrants. Instead, they embodied the idea that justice transcends death, that every act, every choice, would one day be accounted for. This sense of accountability was central to Greek thought. Though the gods were fickle and fate inexorable, the afterlife imposed a kind of order, a final reckoning that even kings could not evade. The Greeks often told of mortals who dared to descend into Hades while still alive, journeys known as katabasis. Heracles descended to capture Cerberus. Orpheus entered to retrieve his beloved Eurydice, only to lose her when he looked back. Odysseus, guided by Circe, sought prophecy in the land of the dead. Each descent carried a message. To enter the underworld was to confront mortality itself, to stand before the truth of human life stripped of illusion. The hero who returned was never unchanged. For the Greeks, these stories reflected not just myth, but experience. They echoed the rituals of mystery cults, in which initiates symbolically passed through death to gain secret knowledge of what lies beyond. At the heart of the underworld lay a story that wove together themes of death, renewal, and the cycle of life itself, the myth of Persephone. Hades seized her from the world above, carrying her into his dark realm to be his queen. Her mother, Demeter, goddess of the harvest, grieved so deeply that she withheld fertility from the earth. Crops withered and famine spread. At last, a compromise was reached. Persephone would spend part of the year with her mother, part with her husband. This cycle explained the seasons: spring and summer for Persephone's return, autumn and winter for her descent. But beyond this, the myth offered something deeper. It suggested that death is not the end, but part of a rhythm that life and death, joy and sorrow, growth and decay are bound together. Persephone's passage gave meaning to the cycle of existence itself. Few stories have lingered in the memory of humankind like that of the Trojan War. It was not merely a tale of warriors and kings. It was the stage on which gods revealed their caprices, heroes pursued glory, and poets sought to preserve the fading memory of a vanished age. To the Greeks, the Trojan War was more than myth. It was a shared cultural memory, a tapestry of legend woven so tightly into their identity that it blurred the boundary between history and imagination. And yet, behind the songs of Homer, behind the divine quarrels and heroic duels, archaeologists and historians have sought to uncover a deeper truth. Was there once a real Troy, and did men once fight upon its walls? The war begins not with spears and armies, but with a quarrel among the gods. At the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, goddess of the sea, the goddess Eris Discord cast a golden apple inscribed to the fairest. Three goddesses laid claim to it: Hera, queen of Olympus; Athena, goddess of wisdom; and Aphrodite, goddess of love. Unable to decide, Zeus entrusted the choice to a mortal, Paris, prince of Troy. Each offered him a bribe. Hera promised dominion, Athena promised victory in war, and Aphrodite promised the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris chose Aphrodite. The woman she gave him was Helen, queen of Sparta, wife of Menelaus. When Paris carried her to Troy, he set in motion the greatest war of myth, a conflict where human passion and divine rivalry became inseparable. Outraged by the insult, Menelaus called upon his brother Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, and together they summoned the princes of Greece to arms. From every corner of the Greek world ships were launched. From Ithaca came Odysseus, reluctant but bound by oath. From Salamis came the giant Ajax. From Thessaly came Achilles. Son of the sea goddess Thetis, his very name a promise of both glory and doom. This gathering of heroes was a rare moment in Greek imagination, a unity of fractious city-states, bound not by empire, but by vengeance and honor. The fleet numbered 1,000 ships, a force so vast that its memory endured for centuries as the measure of Greek power. The war itself was imagined as a long and bitter siege, 10 years of stalemate before the walls of Troy. Homer's Iliad does not tell the whole story, but a fragment, a few weeks in the final year, when rage, pride, and grief brought the war to its tragic climax. At its heart was Achilles, the greatest of the Greek warriors. Offended by Agamemnon's arrogance, he withdrew from battle, and in his absence, the Trojans, led by Prince Hector, drove the Greeks to the brink of defeat. When Hector slew Patroclus, Achilles' beloved companion, grief turned to fury. Re-entering the battle, he cut down Hector in single combat, dragging his body around the walls of Troy in a display of rage so fierce it even shocked the gods. It is here that the Iliad ends, not with victory, but with mourning. For even Achilles, the most invincible of heroes, was destined to fall, struck by an arrow to his heel, the one part of him left vulnerable. The Greeks, unable to take Troy by force, turned to cunning. Odysseus devised the stratagem of the wooden horse. Pretending to abandon the siege, the Greeks left behind a colossal offering to the Trojans, a hollow horse filled with warriors. Despite warnings from Cassandra, cursed always to speak truth but never be believed, and from the priest Lycaon, who declared, "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts." The Trojans brought the horse into their city. That night, while Troy slept, the Greeks emerged, opened the gates, and the city burned. The sack of Troy was merciless. Priam, the old king, was slaughtered at his altar. Women and children were dragged into slavery. The city that had once rivaled the greatest of the East was reduced to ashes, its memory preserved only in song. The war did not end with Troy's destruction. For many heroes, the true trial began on their journey home. Odysseus wandered 10 years across seas and islands, facing monsters, sorcery, and the wrath of Poseidon. Agamemnon returned to betrayal and murder in his own palace. Only a few found peace. Many more perished or brought ruin with them. This cycle of tales, known as the Nostoi, the homecomings, reminds us that war leaves scars not only on the battlefield but on the hearts of those who return. For centuries, the Trojan War was taken as myth. But in the late 19th century, Heinrich Schliemann, a German adventurer and amateur archaeologist, uncovered the ruins of a great city at Hisarlik in modern-day Turkey. Layer upon layer revealed a settlement destroyed and rebuilt across centuries. Among them was a leveled Troy 7 dating to the 12th century BCE, a city that shows signs of fire and war. Could this have been the Troy of Homer? Most scholars believe the war, if it happened, was not as the poets sing, not a conflict of gods and heroes, but perhaps a clash between Greek raiders and a wealthy Anatolian city fought for control of trade routes between the Aegean and the East. The legend that grew from it, however, transcended fact. It became a foundational myth for the Greeks, a story of unity, tragedy, and the price of glory. History often tempts us to separate myth from religion, to think of stories on one hand and sacred practices on the other. But for the ancient Greeks, there was no such boundary. To them, the gods were not simply characters in poems. They were living presences woven into the very fabric of daily existence. Their world was alive with divine will, and the rituals they performed were not just ceremonies. They were essential acts that kept the fragile order of the cosmos in balance. If the myths gave the Greeks their stories, it was ritual that gave them rhythm. The gods of Olympus, Zeus, Athena, Apollo, and countless others were not distant abstractions but beings who demanded honor, sacrifice, and devotion. The Greeks lived in a cosmos where the boundary between human and divine was porous, and where failing to give the gods their due could bring ruin upon a household, a city, or even an empire. For the Greeks, religion was not a matter of belief in doctrines. They had no sacred scripture to be recited in unchanging form, no church to enforce orthodoxy, no single priesthood that spoke for all. Instead, religion was practiced as an ongoing, lived relationship with the gods. What mattered was not so much what one thought about the gods, but what one did for them. This is why sacrifice stood at the heart of Greek religion. The sight of animals being led to an altar, garlanded with ribbons, their horns gilded, was a familiar one in Greek life. At great festivals, oxen were slaughtered by the dozen, their blood poured onto the altar, rising as a fragrant smoke meant to delight the gods. The choicest portions were burned, while the rest was consumed by the community in a great feast. Sacrifice was not merely killing. It was an act of communion, binding the mortal community with the immortal. Every Greek household had its own small hearth altar, where libations of wine, honey, or oil could be poured to the household gods, the ancestors, and the spirits of the dead. To neglect these rites was unthinkable. A man who failed to honor the gods could bring not only his own destruction, but that of his kin. Piety was not just a personal virtue. It was a duty owed to family, community, and cosmos. From this religious imagination arose one of the most enduring features of Greek civilization, the temple. Unlike modern churches, Greek temples were not spaces designed to house congregations. They were houses for the gods themselves. The statue of whether Athena in Athens or Apollo at Delphi was not merely an image, but the very seat of the god's presence. To enter such a temple was to step into the dwelling place of divinity. Consider the Parthenon, rising on the Acropolis of Athens. Within its walls stood the colossal statue of Athena Parthenos, fashioned by Phidias of ivory and gold. Her gleaming form towered over the citizens who came to honor her, a reminder that this city was hers, under her protection. For the Athenians, to offer sacrifices at the Parthenon was not only a religious act, but a civic one, a way of binding the community under the watchful gaze of their patron goddess. Elsewhere, at Olympia, the god Zeus received worship in a temple so magnificent that his statue, also by Phidias, was considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Every 4 years, athletes from across Greece gathered there to compete in his honor. The Olympic Games were not merely contests of strength and speed. They were acts of piety, woven into the religious life of the entire Hellenic world. Religion in Greece was not confined to temples or altars. It spilled into the streets in a calendar marked by festivals. Nearly every month was punctuated by some celebration in honor of a god. At Athens, the Panathenea was held each summer, a grand festival that celebrated Athena herself. Citizens processed through the city, bearing a new robe, a peplos woven for the goddess, and offered it to her statue. Music, poetry, and athletic contests accompanied the rites. The entire city became a stage on which the bond between mortal and divine was renewed. Other festivals carried a more mysterious air. The Eleusinian Mysteries, held each year near Athens, promised initiates a secret knowledge, a glimpse of the cycle of life, death, and rebirth, embodied in the story of Demeter and Persephone. To be initiated was to enter into a sacred fellowship, one that spanned centuries and bound the living with the divine. Even in antiquity, the details of these rites were guarded with silence, but participants spoke of them as a revelation that transformed their understanding of life itself. Then there were the festivals of Dionysus, god of wine, madness, and ecstasy. At these, worshippers abandoned themselves to dance, song, and intoxication, believing that in their frenzy they were touched by the god himself. It was from these celebrations that Greek tragedy was born, plays performed not as entertainment, but as offerings to Dionysus, in which human suffering and divine destiny were brought together on stage. But the gods did not only receive worship, they also spoke. Across Greece, sacred sites were believed to be places where the divine voice broke into the human world, where mortals might receive guidance, warning, or fate itself. Foremost among these was Delphi, the sanctuary of Apollo. Here, high on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, the Pythia, a priestess seated upon a tripod, entered trance and uttered the words of the god. Her riddling prophecies were recorded and interpreted by the priests, and men traveled from across the Mediterranean to seek her counsel. Kings, generals, and city-states consulted the oracle before wars, before founding colonies, before making decisions of destiny. To disregard her voice was perilous. Another oracle lay at Dodona, in Epirus, where Zeus was believed to speak through the rustling of oak leaves. There, priests and priestesses listened to the murmurs of nature, translating them into the voice of the sky god himself. The Greeks believed the world itself was alive with divine utterance, if one only knew how to listen. The moral order of Greek religion revolved around two principles: piety and hubris. Piety, eusebia, meant giving the gods what was due to them, honoring them with proper rites, and acknowledging the limits of human power. Hubris was the opposite: arrogance, excess, and overstepping the bounds of mortality. Greek tragedy is filled with stories of those who committed hubris and paid the price. Niobe, who mocked the goddess Leto and boasted of her many children, saw them slaughtered by Apollo and Artemis. King Pentheus, who scorned Dionysus and denied his divinity, was torn apart by his own mother and sisters in a frenzy of madness. In each tale, the message was clear: mortals must remember their place and honor the gods who ruled over them. This religious ethic was not only personal but political. City-states saw themselves as under the protection of particular gods, and their prosperity was bound to the maintenance of proper worship. To neglect the gods was to court disaster, not only for oneself, but for the community as a whole. Greek religion was not only concerned with the gods of Olympus. Beneath the earth lay another realm, the shadowed world of Hades, Persephone, and the chthonic powers. Here, rites were darker, sacrifices more solemn. Black animals were offered, their blood poured directly into the earth. Libations of milk, honey, and wine were given to the dead, who were believed to linger in the underworld, but who could sometimes be called upon for aid or appeasement. The Greeks did not see death as an end. The rituals of burial were crucial, ensuring that the soul passed into Hades and found its place in the afterlife. To leave a body unburied was one of the gravest crimes imaginable, a violation not only of human dignity, but of divine law. The epic of the Iliad itself ends with such a theme, as Achilles returns the body of Hector to Priam, recognizing that even in war, the gods demand respect for the dead. What strikes us most, perhaps, about Greek religion is its lack of dogma. There was no catechism to memorize, no final authority to define orthodoxy. Myths could be told in many versions, and rituals practiced in local variations. What mattered was not uniform belief, but the shared performance of rites that linked mortals and gods together. In this sense, Greek religion was less about personal conviction than about communal life. It bound together city-states, families, and generations. It offered a framework within which to understand the unpredictable forces of fate, fortune, and death. And though philosophers would later challenge its myths and foreign religions would eventually supplant it, the sacred order of the gods left a mark on Greek life so deep that it continues to shape the imagination of the world to this day. The myths of the gods had endured for centuries. They were sung in epic verse, carved in marble, whispered at hearths, and proclaimed in the smoke of temples. But the Greeks were not only storytellers. They were also questioners, thinkers, skeptics. And slowly, beneath the shadow of Olympus, a new kind of vision began to emerge. One that no longer sought answers in the thunder of Zeus or the whispers of Apollo, but in the patterns of nature, in the principles of logic, and in the workings of the human mind. This was the beginning of philosophy, the love of wisdom. And in Greece, it would bring about nothing less than a revolution of thought. In the 6th century BCE, long before Socrates and Plato, a group of men on the rugged coasts of Ionia, the western edge of Asia Minor, began to ask startlingly simple questions. Thales of Miletus, remembered as one of the 7 sages, looked at the world around him and asked, "What is it made of?" The poets had said the gods created the earth, the sea, and the sky. But Thales instead proposed that water was the first principle, the underlying substance of everything. It was a modest idea, yet radical. For the first time, a Greek had sought to explain the cosmos not through myth, but through nature itself. Thales' successors went further. Anaximander suggested that the world was not born from gods, but from the apeiron, an infinite, boundless substance beyond all forms. Heraclitus of Ephesus declared that everything was in flux, and that the hidden order of the cosmos could be understood through the tension of opposites. These early thinkers, often called the pre-Socratics, were not atheists in the modern sense. They did not deny the gods outright, but they began to strip away the layers of myth and search for an underlying order. Where Hesiod had told of chaos birthing Gaia and Gaia birthing the gods, these philosophers told of elements, principles, and forces. And in doing so, they began the long process of moving the Greek imagination from mythos story to logos reason. The shift was not only in cosmology, but in ethics. If the gods were capricious and unpredictable, then how could mortals live good lives? Could justice, courage, and moderation be defined without reference to Zeus or Athena? By the 5th century BCE, Athens had become the crucible of these questions. The city was a democracy, a place where men debated in assemblies and courts, where rhetoric could sway laws and decide the fates of citizens. It was here that Socrates emerged as a figure as disruptive as he was unforgettable. He wrote nothing himself, but his pupil Plato preserved his voice. Socrates wandered the streets of Athens, stopping craftsmen, merchants, and politicians, asking them probing questions. What is justice? What is piety? What is virtue? Those who thought they knew the answers often found themselves entangled in contradictions. Socrates called himself a gadfly, sent to sting Athens into self-examination. But many saw him as a threat, undermining tradition, and piety cloaked in cleverness. In the year 399 BCE, Athens condemned him to death for corrupting the youth and refusing to honor the gods of the city. His execution was meant to silence him. Instead, it immortalized him. In Plato's writings, Socrates lived on as the mouthpiece of a philosophy that stretched beyond myth and matter. For Plato, the world around us was but a shadow of a higher reality. True knowledge lay not in appearances, but in eternal truths, the forms of justice, beauty, and goodness. Plato's thought reshaped Greek ideas of the divine. For while Homer's gods were many and flawed, Plato hinted at something closer to the one, a perfect, eternal principle beyond the shifting world. In dialogues like the Timaeus, he spoke of a divine craftsman, the demiurge, who shaped the cosmos not through lust or violence, but through reason. In this way, philosophy did not destroy religion, it transformed it. The gods of Olympus remained in ritual and art, but alongside them grew an intellectual quest for the ultimate good. Plato's student, Aristotle, would take this search in a different direction. Unlike Plato, who gazed upward toward the transcendent, Aristotle observed the world as it was. He studied plants and animals, analyzed constitutions, and developed systems of logic that would dominate Western thought for centuries. For Aristotle, the divine was not a pantheon of quarreling figures, but the unmoved mover, the ultimate cause of motion, perfection, and purpose. This god did not hurl thunderbolts or disguise himself among mortals. Instead, it contemplated itself eternally, the purest form of thought. In Aristotle, we see the final step of a journey, from Zeus on his throne to an abstract principle of being, from gods with human faces to the divine as philosophy itself. And yet, even as philosophers debated in the Lyceum and Academy, the old religion endured. Pilgrims still journeyed to Delphi to consult the oracle of Apollo. Festivals still filled the streets with sacrifices and processions. The mysteries of Eleusis still promised salvation through Demeter and Persephone. Philosophy did not replace religion overnight. Instead, the two existed side by side, sometimes clashing, converging. Socrates himself, though accused of impiety, claimed he followed a divine inner voice, a daimonion that guided his actions. Plato filled his dialogues with myths, speaking of the soul's journey and the afterlife. Even Aristotle, the man of observation, spoke of a highest god. In Greece, myth and reason wove together, shaping not only religion but science, politics, and art. The shift from myth to philosophy was not merely intellectual. It reshaped the very course of history. When Rome later absorbed Greek culture, it was not only the statues of Zeus and Athena that crossed the Mediterranean, but the works of Plato and Aristotle. In time, these ideas would pass into Christianity, into Islam, into the very foundation of Western thought. Yet behind it all, the memory of the Greek gods lingered. The thunder of Zeus, the wisdom of Athena, and the love of Aphrodite were not erased by philosophy. They became metaphors, symbols, echoes of an older way of seeing. And so, the Greeks gave the world two gifts: the stories of the gods and the discipline of reason. Together, they remain the twin pillars of human imagination, the mythic and the rational, the poetic and the philosophical. When Alexander of Macedon set out across the known world, he carried not only his armies, but his gods. Zeus, Athena, Dionysus, they marched beside him, their temples rising in far lands, their names carved into new cities. But conquest is a two-edged sword. As Greek gods traveled outward, foreign gods traveled inward. And in this mingling, the old religion of Greece was transformed. This was the Hellenistic age, an age of empires and cosmopolitanism, of uncertainty and longing. It was a time when the gods themselves seemed to wander, exiles in a world larger than ever before. In 323 BCE, Alexander died in Babylon, his empire stretching from Greece to India. But his sudden death left no heir strong enough to hold it together. His generals, the deities, tore it apart, founding kingdoms across Asia, Egypt, and the eastern Mediterranean. These realms were Greek in speech, but diverse in soul. In Alexandria, Syrians, Egyptians, Jews, and Greeks lived side by side. In Antioch, Babylonian temples stood near Greek theaters. In Pergamon, kings built libraries to rival Athens, while priests sacrificed to both Zeus and foreign gods. The Stoics, founded by Zeno of Citium, taught that the universe was ordered by a divine reason, the Logos. To live well was to live in harmony with this rational order, accepting fate without fear or anger. The Epicureans, by contrast, taught that the gods existed but were distant, unconcerned with mortal affairs. Happiness lay in freeing oneself from fear, especially the fear of divine punishment and death. Both schools reflected the same reality. The old gods of Homer and Hesiod, quarrelsome and all too human, seemed less at home in a world of empires and philosophy. But the people still hungered for gods, just not the old Olympians. It was in this age that the mystery cults flourished. Unlike the public rituals of the polis, these were private initiations, promising not just protection in life, but salvation after death. The cult of Isis, the Egyptian goddess, spread across the Mediterranean. To Egyptians, he embodied Osiris, lord of the afterlife. To many, he promised personal redemption. Other cults followed. Dionysus transformed from a god of wine into a liberator of the soul. Cybele, the great mother of Phrygia, worshipped with drums and ecstatic dances. And Mithras, a Persian god whose secret rites would one day find followers among Roman soldiers. These religions spoke to a new need: the need for belonging, transcendence, and salvation in an uncertain age. And what of the gods of Greece? They did not vanish, but they changed. Zeus remained, but now he appeared as Zeus Ammon, merging with the Egyptian god of the sun. Athena became a patroness of cities far beyond Athens. Apollo's oracle at Delphi still spoke, But fewer pilgrims came as other sanctuaries rose in power. The Olympians became cosmopolitan, their forms blending with foreign deities until the boundaries blurred. Yet beneath this blending lay unease. For all its grandeur, the Hellenistic age was a time of fragility. Kingdoms rose and fell. Armies marched. Cities were sacked. The old order, where Zeus upheld justice and Athena protected the city, seemed far away. In its place was a new hunger for gods who could offer protection not just to a community, but to the individual soul. This hunger was not satisfied by sacrifices to distant Olympians. It was satisfied by Isis, Serapis, Dionysus, and the mysteries of Eleusis, by philosophies that promised calm, by cults that spoke of eternal life. The gods had not disappeared. They had been remade to fit a new world. The transformations of the Hellenistic age would echo far beyond Greece. When Rome rose, it would inherit this religious landscape. The Olympians now blended with foreign gods, the mysteries flourishing, philosophy offering spiritual guidance. Rome would take these seeds and spread them across an even larger empire. And within this world, a new religion, Christianity, would be born, drawing on the same needs for salvation, universality, and transcendence that had driven the mysteries. The Olympians, once rulers of Olympus, were by then shadows still honored, still named, but no longer central. When the Roman legions marched across the Mediterranean, they carried not only their weapons, but their gods. And yet, many of those gods were not originally Roman. Jupiter, Juno, and Mars may have been theirs. But the pantheon they built, the myths they told, the temples they raised all bore the unmistakable imprint of Greece. In conquering Greece, Rome was conquered in turn. The Olympians found a second life in Roman marble, Roman ritual, and Roman imagination. But in this new world, they were never quite the same. The Romans had always been a pragmatic people. Their religion, in its earliest form, was rooted in ritual more than myth, strict ceremonies, priesthoods, auguries, and sacrifices to spirits known as the noumena. These were powers of the fields, the hearth, the household, not the grand Olympians of epic poetry. But as Rome expanded into the Greek world in the 2nd century BCE, it absorbed not only Greek art and literature, but also its gods. Zeus became Jupiter Optimus Maximus, lord of the sky and patron of Rome itself. Hera became Juno, protector of marriage and the state. Poseidon merged with Neptune. Apollo retained his name, while Hermes became Mercury. To the Romans, this was not theft, but adaptation. They believed in the concept of interpretatio Graeca, that foreign gods were simply different names for their own. And so, the Olympians entered Rome not as strangers, but as honored guests. In Rome, the gods became intimately tied to the machinery of empire. Temples rose on the Capitoline Hill, where Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva formed the Capitoline Triad, guardians of Rome's destiny. Apollo was adopted as a patron of Augustus, the first emperor, who built a grand temple to him on the Palatine Hill. Venus became the divine ancestor of the Julian family, her bloodline claimed by Julius Caesar himself. The Olympians were not just worshipped, they were woven into Rome's political identity. Victories were dedicated to them. Emperors claimed kinship with them. Festivals were held in their honor across the empire. Yet in this new setting, something had changed. In Greece, the gods had been flawed, human-like, quarrelsome. In Rome, they became more formal, more abstract, more dignified. They were less companions in myth than guardians of empire. The Olympians had become imperial gods. As Rome expanded, so too did its gods. But Rome, like Greece before it, was never exclusive. The Olympians did not drive out foreign deities, they merged with them. In Gaul, Jupiter was worshipped on mountaintops, fused with Celtic sky gods. In Africa, Saturn blended with the old god Baal-Hamon. In the East, Isis, Serapis, and Mithras flourished alongside the Olympians, their cults spreading across Roman cities. The Roman Empire became a vast religious marketplace. The Olympians stood at its center, but they shared space with hundreds of others. This blending gave them new life, but it also diluted their distinctiveness. For when all gods can be merged, no god stands alone. Perhaps the most profound transformation came not from the provinces, but from Rome itself. In the late Republic and early Empire, men began to be worshipped as gods. Julius Caesar was deified after his death. Augustus allowed himself to be honored as the son of a god. Later emperors, especially in the provinces, received temples and sacrifices while still alive. The Olympians had once ruled the heavens. Now they shared it with mortal emperors. This was a profound shift. For many Romans, loyalty to the emperor became as important as devotion to Jupiter or Mars. The divine was no longer distant. It lived in the person of Rome's ruler. The Olympians were still honored, but the center of gravity had shifted. By the 1st century CE, the Olympians faced a challenge unlike any before. The Roman Empire, vast and powerful, was also restless and unstable. Cities rose and burned. Armies rebelled. Emperors were made and unmade. Plagues swept through provinces. And in this world of anxiety, the Olympians offered little comfort. Their rituals were public, tied to the state, formal, and rigid. They protected Rome, but did they protect the soul? For more and more people, the answer seemed to be no. And so, once again, men and women turned to mystery religions. Isis and Serapis, Cybele and Attis, Mithras and his caves all promised what the Olympians could not: personal salvation, eternal life, and the hope of transcendence beyond the grave. The Olympians remained, their temples still grand, their names spoken. But already, the hunger that had once lifted them to Olympus was moving elsewhere. It was in this atmosphere that a small, obscure sect arose in the eastern provinces of the empire. Preaching the teachings of a crucified Jewish prophet, it spread quietly at first, then more widely, carried by merchants, slaves, and missionaries. It offered not just ritual, but redemption, not just protection of the city, but eternal life for the individual soul. At first, Rome dismissed it. Later, it persecuted it. But in time, it would rise to challenge the Olympians themselves. The gods of Greece, remade in Rome, would soon face their greatest trial. For centuries, the Olympians had endured. They had risen from the mountain shrines of Greece, crossed the seas with merchants and colonists, and stood beside the emperors of Rome. They had outlasted wars, invasions, and the rise and fall of kingdoms. But now, they faced an adversary unlike any before. It was not another pantheon, not another cult, not another empire. It was a single faith, a faith that claimed there was only one God, eternal and absolute, and that all others were false. This was Christianity, and in its rise, the Olympians began their long descent into silence. The story begins in an unlikely place, a small province on the eastern edge of the Roman Empire. In Judea, in the early 1st century CE, a man was crucified under Roman rule. His followers claimed he had risen from the dead and that his life and death had fulfilled the promises of the Hebrew prophets. They called him the Messiah, the Christ. At first, his movement was obscure, confined to small gatherings of Jews. But soon, it opened to Gentiles. Paul of Tarsus carried his message across the Mediterranean, preaching not temples or sacrifices, but faith, baptism, and the promise of eternal life. Unlike the Olympians, this God did not live on a mountain or in the clouds. He was not many, but one. He was not born, nor would he die. This was a God who claimed the universe itself. Christianity spread not among the elites, but among the poor, the slaves, the women, the marginalized. Where the Olympians demanded ritual sacrifices, Christianity promised grace. Where the Olympians protected the state, Christianity promised salvation for the individual soul. Where the Olympians had always seemed distant, Christianity claimed that God had once walked among men. It was a religion of intimacy, of community, of hope. Its gatherings were simple bread, wine, and prayers. Its appeal was profound, eternal life, available to anyone, regardless of wealth or status. In a world where the Olympians seemed tied to empire and hierarchy, Christianity promised a kingdom not of this world. And so it grew, slowly at first, then steadily, across cities and provinces, until it could no longer be ignored. The Olympians and their priests did not surrender easily. For centuries, Roman authorities saw Christianity not as a rival religion, but as a dangerous refusal to worship the state gods. Sacrifice to Jupiter, to Mars, to the emperor himself, these were civic duties. To deny them was to deny Rome. And so Christians were persecuted. Some were burned alive. Others were thrown to the beasts in arenas. Many died nameless, their stories remembered only in whispered hymns and letters. To the defenders of the old gods, this was loyalty to tradition, to the ancestral ways that had protected Rome for centuries. To the Christians, it was martyrdom, and each death only strengthened the movement, giving it heroes, stories, and an unshakable conviction that their God was stronger than death itself. The Olympians, for the first time, were not just being neglected. They were being openly defied. By the 3rd century CE, Christianity had spread throughout the empire. In cities from Antioch to Alexandria, from Carthage to Rome itself, communities flourished. They had bishops, councils, and scriptures. The Olympians were still honored, temples were filled, and sacrifices were made. But for the first time in memory, their place was no longer secure. Then came the 4th century, and with it, a seismic change. The Emperor Constantine, facing a civil war, claimed to have seen a vision of the Christian God, a cross in the sky, with the words, "In this sign, conquer." He won the battle, and in gratitude, he legalized Christianity. In 313 CE, the Edict of Milan granted Christians the freedom to worship openly. Persecution ended. Churches rose. Bishops became powerful figures in imperial politics. The Olympians were still worshipped, but the balance was shifting. In 325 CE, Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea, bringing bishops from across the empire to define the faith. No emperor had ever done such a thing for the Olympians. Their cults had always been local, diverse, and competing. But here, a single god was being given a single creed. Christianity was becoming not just tolerated, but organized. By the end of the 4th century, under the Emperor Theodosius, it went further still. Pagan rituals were banned. Temples were closed. Sacrifices forbidden. The Olympians, who had once been honored by emperors, were now outlawed by them. Statues of Zeus, Apollo, and Athena still stood in marble, but their worship had ended. Their altars lay cold. In less than a century, the Olympians had gone from the gods of empire to relics of the past. Not all gave up. Some philosophers, like the Neoplatonist Proclus, still honored the old gods in secret. The Emperor Julian, called the Apostate, tried briefly to restore pagan worship in the mid-4th century. He built temples, revived rituals, and invoked the Olympians in his writings. But his reign was short. He died in battle in 363 CE. With him died the last serious attempt to revive the Olympians as the gods of empire. The Christians called his death the judgment of God. Pagans called it the end of an age. The Olympians would never return. Yet they did not vanish entirely. The temples of Athens and Corinth, of Rome and Ephesus, still stood, though now often repurposed as churches. The poets of old Homer, Hesiod, and the tragedians were still read, though their gods were treated as metaphors, not realities. Zeus became Jupiter, but as a mythological figure, not a living god. Athena became the symbol of wisdom, not the goddess of a city. Apollo lived on in art, but no longer in prayer. The Olympians had descended from heaven to literature, from worship to allegory. They had once ruled the world. Now they lived only in memory. The Olympians had fallen silent. Their temples lay in ruins, their statues toppled or reused, their rituals outlawed. By the 6th century CE, few still prayed to Zeus or sacrificed to Apollo. Christianity had triumphed, and the Olympians had faded from living faith. But gods do not vanish entirely. Though banished from worship, the Olympians endured in other forms. They became memory, metaphor, symbol. They became stories retold by poets, philosophers, and artists. They became figures of literature rather than of devotion. In their afterlife, the Olympians proved that even when belief ends, imagination continues. In late antiquity, Christian scholars did not destroy all pagan texts. Plato and Homer, Hesiod and the tragedians, these works were preserved, copied in monasteries, and studied by clerics. To Christians, the Olympians were no longer gods, but myths. They were taken as allegories of moral truths, or as distorted memories of ancient kings. St. Augustine wrote of them in The City of God, denouncing them as false and corrupt, yet still acknowledging their cultural weight. And so the Olympians lived on, not as deities, but as cautionary tales, examples of what the new world had left behind. Yet in rural valleys and mountain villages, traces of their worship lingered longer than the law allowed. In Arcadia, in the Peloponnesian hills, peasants still whispered of Pan, the goat-footed god of wild places. In Thessaly, farmers still muttered charms invoking old spirits of the land. The Olympians had been dethroned, but they had not been erased. They survived in folklore, in superstition, in names carved into stones and whispered in secret. Even as Christianity spread, the memory of the gods clung to the landscape itself. The ruins of their temples stood on every hill, their images carved into coins, their names woven into the very geography of Greece. Centuries passed. Europe entered the Middle Ages. The Olympians were studied, but from a distance, as relics of a pagan past. Then, in the 15th century, a new movement began. Renaissance humanists, searching the libraries of Byzantium and Italy, rediscovered the classics. They read Homer and Plato not as enemies of Christianity, but as sources of wisdom, beauty, and art. Suddenly, the Olympians lived again not as gods, but as muses. Painters filled canvases with scenes of Venus rising from the sea, Apollo with his lyre, and Athena in gleaming armor. Sculptors carved marble forms of Zeus and Hercules. Poets wrote new epics in the old style, weaving the Olympians into their verses. The gods of Olympus had been dethroned, but they had not been forgotten. They had found a new kingdom not in temples, but in imagination. In the centuries that followed, the Olympians became the language of culture. When philosophers sought to describe beauty, they invoked Apollo. When they spoke of wisdom, they cited Athena. When they described chaos or desire, they turned to Dionysus and Aphrodite. Even as Europe turned to science and reason, the Olympians remained as metaphors for forces within the human soul. Friedrich Nietzsche spoke of the tension between Apollo, the god of order, and Dionysus, the god of passion. Psychologists and artists alike found in these figures timeless symbols of the human condition. The Olympians no longer ruled the skies, but they ruled the imagination. Today, their names linger everywhere. Planets bear the names of Roman gods Jupiter, Mars, and Venus. The Olympic Games still celebrate human strength and glory in honor of their ancient mountain. Brands, ships, and cities carry their titles. We no longer sacrifice bulls to Zeus. But when lightning splits the sky, we still speak of thunderbolts. We no longer pray to Hermes. but his winged staff still symbolizes medicine. We no longer pour wine to Dionysus, but in the laughter of revelry, he still smiles. The Olympians have not vanished. They have become immortal in a new way, woven into culture, language, and art, long after belief has faded. The story of the Olympians is not only the story of the gods, it is the story of how human beings create and how human beings remember. For centuries, Zeus, Athena, Apollo, and their kin shaped how men and women understood the world. They explained storms and earthquakes, harvest and famine, love and war. They offered comfort in chaos and gave form to the unknown. And then, belief shifted. Another faith rose, and the Olympians were cast aside. But still, their presence lingers. In poetry, in language, in the very symbols that shape our thought, they remain. What does it mean that the Olympians endured, not as deities, but as metaphors? It suggests something universal, that gods are not only supernatural beings. They are mirrors. They reflect human experience, our fears, our desires, our struggles. Zeus embodies power and its dangers. Athena, wisdom and strategy. Aphrodite, the pull of love and longing. Dionysus, the intoxicating madness of joy. The Greeks made gods in their image, larger than life, yet deeply human. And in this, they created figures that could outlast their own faith. The Olympians remind us that divinity is not only about worship, it is about meaning. The ruins of Olympus also tell another truth. Belief is fragile. For centuries, people thought the gods unshakable. Yet within a few generations, the rituals that had endured since Homer were outlawed, abandoned, forgotten. This reminds us that every system of belief, no matter how powerful, exists only as long as humans sustain it. Faith is not eternal. It is lived, spoken, remembered. And when it ceases to be lived, it passes into history. The Olympians show us how swiftly the eternal can fade. And yet, the fact that we are speaking of them still, that poets, artists, and filmmakers retell their myths thousands of years later, shows another truth. Stories endure even when belief does not. The gods have become myths, and myths have become literature. They have survived because their stories continue to speak to something within us, questions of power, of love, of mortality, of fate. When we read of Prometheus, punished for giving fire to mankind, we are not worshiping. We are asking what it means to seek knowledge and what price it demands. When we read of Achilles, driven by rage and doomed by pride, we are not recalling ritual. We are reflecting on human weakness. The Olympians endure because their myths are human stories, and humans will always seek meaning in stories. Civilizations rise and fall. Empires expand and collapse. Faiths emerge, flourish, and vanish. And yet, what outlives them is memory. The temples of the Olympians have crumbled, but the memory of the gods has outlived the marble. The stories once told to children in Athens are still told to children in London, Lagos, and New York. History shows us that civilizations may die, but culture persists. Fragments are carried forward, reborn in different forms, in different voices. The Olympians are one of those fragments. They are the echo of an ancient world still audible today.